The sinking by a torpedo hit of the Iranian frigate IRIS Dena on February 4th, some 375 kilometers from the Indian shores, has ignited a fierce debate in India. The sinking of the warship returning to Iran after taking part in a multi country naval fleet review in India cut too close for New Delhi's comfort, both in terms of its nautical proximity as well as its political fallout for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Although the strike happened in the international waters and reportedly after the US submarine commander warned the Iranian frigate, it has set off several questions. To understand some of the details, MCR spoke to C. Uday Bhaskar, one of India's foremost strategic and military affairs experts and a retired Indian Navy Commodore. Uday Bhaskar. Welcome to Mayanshah Reports. Uday, it's always a great pleasure to have you.
Ditto, Mayank. I always look forward to being invited by you.
Uday, how common or normal is it for a nuclear submarine from any country, let alone from the US, to be essentially brushing past about 200 nautical miles or 370 kilometers to the exclusive economic zone? Is that a common occurrence?
Number one, nuclear-powered submarines are a very rare kind of underwater platform. There are not too many of them. Only the major powers have them, as in the United States, Russia, UK, France, China, and India are the only nations that have this capability. And when they are deployed, they remain undetected. Generally, and this is a thumb rule, they do not come very close to the coastline of any other country unless there is an overwhelming operational need. So in the specific instance that we are talking about, which is the sinking of the Iranian ship, the IRIS Dena, by the United States using an SSN, which is the nuclear propelled submarine, at a location which is approximately 30 nautical miles in Sri Lanka's exclusive economic zone. So it's very proximate. Whether you say it was 20 nautical miles or 40 nautical miles, it's a very small kind of difference, in the maritime domain. So that is unusual. Unless there is, as I said, an overwhelming tactical operational need. And in this case, it appears that the United States found it necessary or came to a determination that they would acquire this Iranian ship and neutralize it, which is to say sink it, by using a torpedo. So this is an unusual occurrence, both in terms of the proximity and the choice of a spot in the ocean that is so close both to Sri Lanka and to India.
Is it then, are you saying clearly that nuclear submarines are not detectable, period?
Yes, that's the thumb rule. I mean, that is why they are considered to be such potent platforms. The idea of a nuclear-powered submarine is that it remains underwater for extended periods. It can be for months on end. The endurance is determined not by the material state of the boat or the reactor, but by the endurance of the crew. Otherwise, technically,
I was thinking more in terms of when it approaches the surface, or it doesn't have to approach the surface to fire a torpedo.
Nuclear-powered submarine does not surface. It only surfaces when it leaves harbor, enters harbor.
The reason I'm asking these elementary questions is because these have not been explained by anyone. So I'm glad you're clarifying that.
So that's the whole idea, that when the first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus, had carried out a successful patrol, it remained totally undetected and underwater. So this is the USP of a nuclear-powered boat, that it can remain underwater for extended periods. And the only sort of determining factor is human endurance. Or in the very unlikely event that there is some kind of a technical failure or a technical glitch that compels the submarine to surface.
Okay.
So that is the difference between a nuclear-powered boat and...
And it could have fired a torpedo from any depth.
Say again?
It could have fired its torpedo from any depth?
Well, technically, the torpedo will be fired only when you have acquired the target.
Fair enough,
And
but I'm thinking at what depth should it be?
well, basically, it should be at a depth that would ensure that contact is made. If you go too deep, you have to traverse water, which means that is three-dimensional.
Right.
You have to traverse a certain length. You also have to surface to be able to hit the surface ship, because the surface ship will only have a draft of between 3 to 5 meters, depending on the size of the ship. So therefore, the submarine has to be launched at such a depth that it can both traverse the longitudinal, the x-axis, and also the y-axis to be able to reach that particular height. So that's a very calibrated kind of a decision. So in this case, I'm sure the US submarine would have found the appropriate depth to make sure that the target was acquired and the torpedo made contact and the ship sank. So it was successful, but also historically, I think the US Secretary of War, Mr. Hegseth, made this point that it's after 1945, the end of World War II, 2026. So we are talking of almost 81 years in terms of the use of a torpedo by a US submarine. Because the last time there was such an exigency was in the Falklands War of 1982. And knowing your mind, it's quite possible that you covered that war. You're like Rip Van Winkle. There's no war that you have not covered.
Unfortunately, fortunately not. But I'm glad.
The Royal Navy, UK used a submarine at that time against Argentina. But which is why I said the use of SSNs is a rare occurrence. That's my point.
Yeah. Now, it's an interesting segue you gave me. I was going to ask you about the fact that it's for the first time in 81 years that a torpedo was used. How do you read? Is there any particular significance to that, or just an operational detail?
No, it's an operational detail, meaning that if you have a capability, you decide when to use it.
Okay.
We just said earlier on that only 6 nations have nuclear-propelled underwater platforms. Within that, the United States leads the pack.
Right.
The United States has only nuclear-powered submarines. Other countries have diesel submarines because they cannot afford to have only nuclear-powered. And the SSN of the United States is in a class by itself. It's a very lethal platform. And any country uses military capability on an as-required basis. So in this particular case, clearly, President Trump and his team came to a determination that they would pick up an adversary, an enemy ship in the Indian Ocean. Did they need to do it? My reading is perhaps not. But then I'm not privy to the intelligence that the United States has. Maybe, and this is my conjecture, they could say that they had received intelligence that the Iranians are going to use the ship to pick up an American asset in the Arabian Sea. And therefore, they had to neutralize it. Anyway, this is actually not a point that we can really question, because at war, any enemy ship, I'm talking about the naval maritime domain, is a legitimate target.
Right.
So nobody, personally, I would say that one cannot question as to was the US, within its rights, as it were, in the conduct of war to carry out this torpedo attack. The short answer is yes.
Yeah, just one last technical detail before I get into a broader picture. The Dena was a 1,500-ton frigate. Typically, how long does it take for a vessel like that to sink fully?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Much depends on the extent of the damage.
Okay.
Suppose a boat is hit by multiple torpedoes. There are cases where ships have been struck by more than one torpedo, in which case the rate of sinking is much faster. Suppose you have 3 gaping holes at the right depth in terms of the ship taking in water, then the rate of sinking would be much faster. If the ship is struck only at one point where the crew is able to, in a way, make sure that it is watertight and only that part of the ship has water entering. This has happened in World War II. Ships have been hit by torpedoes and they've managed to carry out damage control and, in a way, not sanitize, but seal that compartment and ensure no more water would enter into the rest of the ship. And they have actually used their propulsion to enter harbor and limp their way back to harbor. Some extraordinary tales of endurance. So the warship is a very sturdy platform. And of course, if it is hit in a very, very damaging way, like in India, if you remember, we had the INS Kochi in the 1971 war. The Argentinians lost their cruiser in the 1982 Falklands War. So much depends on where the ship is hit and the rate at which water enters and basically
Okay.
makes the ship unstable and sinks.
Going by the unclassified video released by the U.S. Department of Defense, one gets the sense that it's practically split into half, and if you go purely visually.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that was the images that we saw that were released by the United States. That it was, you're split. It was literally, I think, hit dead center, leading to this kind of destruction of the ship and its hull, which led to the sinking.
And just the final question about that part, as a sailor of great standing yourself, you were there in the Navy for 37 years, I think, right?
Yes, I was.
Describe to me what goes through a sailor's mind. I know it's difficult for you to speculate on that, but something like that happening at sea, what happens?
Again, I can only speculate, conjecture, because my own experience at sea has been limited. I never took part in a war. For India, the big naval war was 1971, and we were under trainees at that time. I had just joined the Navy, but I do know from talking to colleagues and those who were part of the 1971 war and who were on the cookery. As a matter of fact, I had course-mates, my contemporaries, who were midshipmen, sub-lieutenants at that time on board the cookery. And their tales, were something that we all shared as young people. So that was a first-hand kind of account. That it all happened in a split second, meaning the ship is hit. And there is obviously a lot of, shall we say, attempt to try and ensure that the damage is controlled, which is why we use the term damage control on board the ship. But it's not successful. And then in a matter of minutes, you have lifeboats being lowered, you have life rafts being cast, and much depends whether it's dark or there is light. Has it happened in daytime or at night? If it happens at night, it becomes that much more difficult. There's obviously a lot of chaos. And there's a lot of, shall we say, destruction that has happened in the ship itself. There could be fire, there could be explosions, depending on where the attack has taken place. So it's a very, very tragic kind of, shall we say, sequence of events. Now, some of these, of course, have been brought into a visual frame, particularly when you think of films like the Titanic, or if you think of any of the World War II films, when you see both, the expanse of the ocean and how puny the individual is, the human being. And then you're really at the mercy of nature and the ocean. And when the end comes, it's very swift. Now, unfortunately, we cannot think of any first-hand accounts, because once you have lost your life at sea, only you know.
Indeed.
What are the thoughts? The rest of it is, we talk about people who were rescued. And those accounts are with us. But I think those final moments, when you go down to the bottom of the sea, and this is not something that's happened, recently. For centuries, ever since the human species has endeavored to cross the oceans, ships have been sunk by natural disasters, by storms, or by human intervention, which is to say that warlike activities have led to ships being sunk, and many lives have been lost. It's tragic. It's also epic at one level, when you think of how the human lives can be lost at sea.
Yeah. To broaden a bit, do you think the US Navy should have, or indeed did give its Indian counterpart any heads up on the presence of the submarine? Or I'm not saying they are obliged to, but do you think they should have?
No, again, let me sort of try and attempt a nuanced response. Number one, no submarine, no Navy is going to give the adversary a heads up. You're at war. So the submarine commander would have been given instructions to pick up, the target. Every Iranian ship is a legitimate target. The submarine would have definitely been given inputs. There would be other agencies in the United States military tracking the ship. So that information would have been made available. And the entire US network that was engaged in this operation from the headquarters at different levels would be aware. Nobody would disclose the submarine's location or what kind of action it would take. That is left to the commander. But, and this is the but that I want to introduce, the United States could have perhaps done something more than what it did to ensure that there was a better rescue at sea. More lives could have been saved. That is my limited point.
No, but I think you perhaps misheard. I was not saying they should have alerted the Iranians. I'm saying they should have perhaps given heads up to India, given that we do not tire of talking about the 21st century's most important strategic relationship between the two countries.
So,
That's what I was.
you're right. There's a lot of dismay in India about the fact that India was, surprised. The Iranian ship was a guest. We had the International Fleet Review, and the optics for the Modi government were not looking good at all. And yes, there's been a lot of dismay. The opposition parties have also made very strong statements about this. But objectively, keeping the politics aside, I would say that definitely for India, this was a setback in terms of, shall we say, the optics of the whole event. For the United States, an operation of this nature, would they have shared this information with India? Unlikely. Submarine operations are very confidential, very secret. Only the submarine commander and his immediate vertical would know about the operation. So I think it would be unfair to say that the United States should have informed India, because then the onus on India becomes even more difficult. Suppose hypothetically the Indian government or the Prime Minister was informed. What does he do? Can he inform Iran? Does he keep it with himself? So I think this is not a probable situation.
Yeah.
My sense is that India was not in the loop.
Indeed.
I have no smoking gun. But I repeat this point that after the submarine had discharged its ordnance, the torpedo, and the ship was sinking, the United States had the ability to ensure that the distress signals were picked up in a more enabling manner. In this case, if you remember the sequence of events, it was the Iranian ship that put out the distress signal as they were sinking. That was picked up by various agencies, including Sri Lanka and India. And because it was closer to Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan Navy was the first to respond. And in turn, they coordinated some activities. But I personally am of the view, I've said this in print when I wrote about this, that perhaps the rescue effort could have been more nimble, could have been more collective, and could have been more empathetic. Right. And I believe that more lives would have been lost.
Yeah.
And if you permit me, since you are going to be showing this in the United States, I had written an article in which I flipped the whole situation and spoke about a hypothetical scenario where if an American platform had been in a similar situation and it was American sailors who had to be saved because their ship had been struck and they were similarly shipwrecked or survivors to be picked up, and a distress signal had been sent, my sense is that the regional response, including that of India, would perhaps have been far more nimble and more effective, and more lives would have been saved. So this is the slightly, I would say, to me, uneasy, and I'm a bit saddened, if I could put it that way, that the code of the sea, the code of the sea is that whenever there is a survivor who has to be picked up, rescued, it doesn't matter what nationality.
Right.
The code of the sea says that whoever is able to should respond, whether it's a merchant ship, a warship, it can even be a sailing boat. I mean, we have had instances in India of Indian sailors. We have a very well-known sailor in India, Tomi Abhilash, who won the Golden Globe, who spoke about, an occasion when he diverted his own sailboat because there was somebody who had to be picked up at sea because he was there and he got the signal. So it's in that sense, I'm of the view, personal view, minority view, that the rescue effort could have been more empathetic.
Yeah.
And the United States is culpable in this.
Okay. To conclude, we now know that India has indeed given refuge to another warship at Kochi, which is at Kochi right now. That's what I heard and read. And that the Indian Navy did indeed respond to the Dena's distress call. How do you read that in a broader strategic frame, given that India has been under severe criticism?
This is a very complex issue, mainly because, as you know, apart from India, Sri Lanka has also given access to another Iranian ship because it had a technical problem. Now, what happens is that the United States and Iran are at war. It's actually US plus one, which is US and Israel, versus Iran. any nation that is seen to be providing support could be termed belligerent.
Right.
And given the kind of characteristics that we associate with President Donald Trump, and the fact that he takes umbrage, even, shall we say, when nations act in a certain manner, it is seen as a personal kind of insult to him. And he has used various measures to punish nations. He has insulted leaders in public. So nations are very wary. And there is a protocol which says that if a man of war of a state that is at war has any kind of machinery failure or a humanitarian exigency, and it has to enter harbor, then there are certain guidelines under which a coastal state, whether it's a Sri Lanka or an India in this case, can provide that kind of access and support. But this is a limited window.
Okay.
But Sri Lanka has dealt with this, I would say, very intelligently, which is that innovatively, that they have allowed the Iranian ship to enter and they disembark the entire crew. The Iranian crew is technically now under quarantine. Not quarantine, but definitely they're not on board.
Right.
So that way I'm sure they're consulting and keeping the Americans informed. But we have not had such a situation where the United States has been directly involved. And smaller states, whether it's Sri Lanka or countries like India, have had to take a decision about how to deal with the humanitarian part. Because there is a convention, a protocol to say that if a ship is in distress, there is an obligation, as per the conventions, to provide that assistance.